if you're expecting from me great stories of heroism, Keanu Reeves style sort of in Speed or something like that, of being a great leader that somehow gets in the way of harm, I have one small example in the end, and that is it, unfortunately. So I thought I might need to sort of deal with expectations right now. The reason why Andrew asked me, I think, to speak is that he knows that I'm extremely good at making mistakes and a little okay at learning from them. So to some extent, some of this will draw upon my mistakes rather than great examples of heroism. And as Andrew said, there is something quite attractive about leaders who take a hit. And while a lot of society might seem, particularly if you read the right-wing press, you might think that society is drifting more and more away from the gospel and gospel ethics, quite a lot of management theory and discussions about corporate behaviour is actually adopting quite a lot of the gospel in terms of aspects around servant leadership and leadership that takes a hit. So the benefits of servant leadership are recognised by the Harvard Business Review, that happy, contented employees that feel that they've got good leadership that cares for them is actually a great bonus for productivity. But of course, there is actually something inbuilt in organisations that makes it very difficult for that to occur. One, of course, is sin, that we all have. The other is that the larger the organisation, the more there is a tendency to be rewarded for managing up rather than managing down. Now, you might say that that's a problem inbuilt in large organisations. In some ways, it's understandable because large organisations, we're all under pressure, organisations are under pressure, so it's not easy for someone at the top or people near the top to see how their underlying managers are managing their staff. They're more likely to see how their underlying managers are relating to them. So the rewards for managing down, for looking after staff, can sometimes not be as great as what can be the rewards for managing up. So you might want to ask, how is it best to be a servant leader? And Andrew, I think, has touched upon this. And my answer to that at the start sound really Sunday school-like. So you might sort of think, oh goodness, why is Allan Bulman even talking? Might as well just have gone to a Sunday school class. But the two major points are to look to Jesus, and I think Andrew has touched on this already, to look to Jesus as Jesus a leader, but that's not enough. So to the extent that in the secular world, management theory might look at Jesus as a good example of leadership, but it's not going to get us there just to look at Jesus. We need to trust in Jesus as well. So a couple of Bible passages that I picked up from that, which pretty much back up what Andrew's been saying. If you look at Isaiah 32, there's a messianic statement around leadership. See, a king will reign in righteousness and rulers will rule with justice. Each one will be like a shelter for the wind. And you can imagine back in the Middle East, being a shelter from wind and sun is actually incredibly important. And so a leader is someone that people can potentially take refuge in. And to state some really obvious parts of the Bible from Mark 10, the example of Jesus, the Son of Man, he did not come to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And Philippians 2 from verse 5, Paul commends people that in their relations with one another they should have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who being in the very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he took on the character of a servant. So that's the example, and the way that we can take that example is by trusting in Jesus, that through Jesus' life, death and resurrection we have life with him both now and forever in the new heavens and the new earth. And that's an amazing, that's the gospel, everyone. I mean, as I say, it's pretty Sunday school, but this is the gospel. This is the thing you need to trust in. If you're not trusting in Jesus, your leadership as a Christian in the workplace will be compromised. So that's my little Sunday school theological sort of rendition of how to be a good leader in the workplace. The best way to unpack that is to again go into my mistakes And what stops us from being servant leaders? And I think there are three major things that can stop us from being servant leaders, from not taking a hit for our teams. The first is greed. Greed is endemic in our society among both Christians and non-Christians. I don't think we are that different from the rest of the world in that regard. So I was talking to someone a few weeks ago, and he said that in his church in the North Shore in Sydney, they went to their GP and said, we're thinking about issues around men's health. What is the biggest men's health issue that you're experiencing as a GP? And he said it was greed. Greed was the biggest men's health issue that he was dealing with as a GP. That's because that from greed comes overwork, comes over commitment, comes stress, comes fear. It's very, very hard, I think, to be a good leader, and I'm going to be quite controversial here. I think it's very hard to be a good leader if you've taken what our society says is the thing you should do, which is buy a house in the best suburb, have the biggest mortgage, and send your kids to private schools. Sorry, that's blunt, but I think it's very hard if you're in that situation, because as soon as you're threatened, that mortgage and those commitments are going to be such that you will be tempted to put yourself ahead of your staff, or put yourself ahead of almost everybody, to be brutally frank. So I think that is the first thing that you need to think about. If you want to be a leader, you need to think about not going into the idolatry of greed, but to trust in Jesus and his provision. That may also mean, and I'm going to be also controversial here and say it may also mean that you may hit a career glass ceiling. I have not necessarily progressed as much as I perhaps could, simply because to progress to certain positions I would have had to have worked so hard it would have had a detrimental effect on my life and my family, and I wasn't prepared to do it. But to some extent, in fact, I progressed to some extent, I think, a little too far and a little too fast in my career because I have made some of those sacrifices. So I think you need to think to yourself, okay, I could get to become a partner in a major law firm, for example. I'm just picking that out of the air. Some people and some Christians can do that because they're just brilliant, right? But if you're not brilliant but just good, and it actually involves way too much sacrifice, you may need to consider whether that's the path for you. So greed is a real killer in terms of good leadership, I think. An element of that is fear and lack of trust in God. So I think I found that where I was promoted very, very quickly in the workplace, and when I was in my 30s, I was managing staff in their 50s. So what possibly could go wrong with that? What could possibly go wrong? And getting promoted quickly at a certain point, and it just happened to coincide with Rosemary and I having our child Amy and all sorts of other aspects in my life, the fear that I might fail drove sometimes quite a lot of not such good behaviour. So where, in a dog-eat-dog world, so to speak, you're fearful of your position, again, temptation not to do the right thing can come into it. And another aspect of that, and this is the third thing that is, I think, stops us from being servant leaders or taking a hit, is seeing the worst in others. We all, as a part of being sinful beings, we all have a habit of explaining away our behaviour and then looking at the other person and demonising their behaviour, and it may well be the same behaviour. So in conflict, it's our natural position to think, oh, I acted that way because I was really, really tired. That person acted that way because they're just out for themselves. It's very easy to fall into that trap. Now, I'm not saying there are some people in the workplace that are so motivated by selfishness and greed and everything else, but there is also a lot of common grace in the workplace, and there's a lot of people who themselves, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, are battling with their motivations and wanting to do the right thing, but by the same time dealing with issues around greed and fear, as I've mentioned before. And so I think it's quite it's quite a temptation in the workplace, and I think it's a temptation that we need to call out as Christians, because as Christians we think, well, we're here to do the right thing, so we cognitively think, oh well, Christians, we're trying to be servant leaders, we're trying to do the right thing, we're trying to care for people and love people, and so cognitively we think we're on the side of the angels, but those other people over there, they're just out for themselves. But it's never quite as simple as that, and sometimes we've got to be careful not to demonise others. And so I think Psalm 73 helps us with that, while Psalm 73 actually talks about people who are not doing the right thing. The author of that psalm says his feet almost slipped, he nearly lost his foothold because he envied the arrogant. And when he saw the prosperity of the wicked, he looked at them, he said, they had no struggles, their bodies were healthy, everything's going well. And then he says, surely in vain I kept my heart pure and I've washed my hands in innocence. Now I think in my life there's often been the temptation subconsciously to get into that thinking. I see these people who are doing incredibly well by managing up and not managing their staff, and I think, oh, I might have to do a bit of that myself. I might have to not care so much about my staff and spend more of my time managing up. There's nothing wrong with managing up as such. It's just a question of balance, I guess. But that is I think a temptation that as a Christian in the workplace we have to be very, very careful about. Now it's in this area where I can actually give you my one heroic case. So don't get too excited. It's not that heroic, to be honest. But one of the things I noticed is that where I was politically shafted in the workplace, it was incredibly powerful testimony to give those people. So a couple of times where I was politically shafted, for want of a better word, and when I had to then work with those people on the next project, I let bygones be bygones completely and just kept working with them. And it really broke the ice in terms of relationships. Forgiveness has an amazing effect on the workplace. Now, it may not have an effect on everybody because some people might be so after themselves, so interested in themselves, or they may be a psychopath or something like that. But most people are not in that. Let's face it, that's a very small minority of people in reality. And if you're in an organisation where there's a lot of people like that, well, just leave. Let's just be blunt about it. But for most people, forgiveness actually goes a long way in smoothing relationships. So that's where I think end. So as I say, I can't show you any great Keanu Reeves type sort of actions or anything like that. And I've never looked like Keanu Reeves, even though deep down I would have liked to have. But that's life. Given with, God gives you with what you've got, and looks certainly wasn't one for me. But the main thing I would say is be very, very aware of trusting in Jesus and not following the idols of greed, and forgiving people and trying to love people, and you might well then, as a leader, do far better than me. Thanks.